This morning at 2:47 p.m., a federal judge delivered a ruling that sent shockwaves through the legal community and beyond. And before you think this is speculation about what might happen in the appeals process, I need you to understand what actually occurred in that Washington, D.C. courtroom. I am not talking about a procedural delay or a partial victory for the defense. I am not talking about a minor scheduling dispute that will be resolved in weeks. I am talking about Special Counsel Jack Smith standing before Judge Eileen Cannon and watching as she granted a motion that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of the most significant federal prosecution in modern American history. I am talking about a defendant who has spent months claiming complete innocence suddenly facing the reality that 40 federal counts are proceeding to trial, and his legal team's desperate attempts to derail this case have failed at every critical juncture. I have prosecuted federal cases for 30 years. I have been in courtrooms when judges ruled on motions to dismiss. I have seen defense attorneys argue that charges should be dropped, that evidence should be suppressed, that entire cases should be thrown out. But I have never seen a defendant react the way this defendant reacted when Judge Cannon denied the final motion to dismiss and set a firm trial date for the classified documents case. The courtroom observers reported something unprecedented. As the judge read her ruling, methodically rejecting each defense argument, the defendant, who has projected defiance and confidence for months, began to visibly break down. His shoulders slumped, his hands started shaking, and by the time the judge finished speaking, sources tell me he was openly weeping at the defense table. Here is what makes this moment so significant. This was not just a legal setback. This was the collapse of a strategy. The strategy that delay tactics would work indefinitely. The strategy that attacking the prosecutor would discredit the case. The strategy that claiming political persecution would convince a judge to dismiss federal charges. When Judge Cannon said the trial will proceed as scheduled, and when she systematically destroyed every argument the defense had presented, that strategy shattered completely. So here is what I am going to do. I am going to walk you through what happened in that courtroom minute by minute. I am going to show you exactly how Judge Cannon dismantled the defense arguments. I am going to describe the defendant's reaction as each motion was denied. And I am going to explain what this ruling means for the timeline to trial. Because here is what this decision means in plain English. The judge did not believe the defense claims of prosecutorial misconduct. The judge found the evidence is admissible. The judge ruled the charges are legally sound. And the defendant is going to face a jury on all 40 counts related to classified documents, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The only question now is whether he will be convicted on all counts or just most of them. I will be covering this case through every hearing, every motion, every development based on evidence, not spin. If you want to understand what happens when federal prosecutors bring a classified documents case and the defense runs out of delay tactics, stay with me. Now let me show you exactly what happened when Judge Cannon delivered her ruling. Let me walk you through the timeline because every moment tells a story. The hearing began at 9:00 a.m. with the defense making their final argument for dismissal. Lead defense counsel stood at the podium for 47 minutes, arguing that Special Counsel Jack Smith lacked authority to bring these charges, that the case was politically motivated, and that the evidence was obtained through illegal searches. The defendant sat at the defense table, occasionally whispering to his attorneys, maintaining the confident posture he has displayed throughout this process. At 10:15 a.m., the prosecution began their response. Special Counsel Jack Smith himself took the podium, a move that surprised court observers because he rarely argues motions personally. For 32 minutes, Smith methodically addressed each defense argument, citing case law, presenting evidence, and explaining why the charges not only meet federal standards but represent one of the clearest cases of classified document mishandling in American legal history. The defendant's demeanor began to change. Court reporters noted he stopped whispering to his lawyers and started staring down at the table. At 11:30 a.m., Judge Cannon called a brief recess. When court resumed at 11:45 a.m., she began reading her ruling from the bench. Here is what I need you to understand about federal judges. They do not make snap decisions on cases of this magnitude. Judge Cannon had clearly spent days, possibly weeks, analyzing every argument, reviewing every precedent, and crafting a ruling that would withstand appellate review. What she delivered was a masterclass in judicial reasoning. Defense Argument 1. Special Counsel Jack Smith lacks constitutional authority to prosecute this case. Quote, "The appointment of special counsels has been upheld repeatedly by federal courts, including the Supreme Court. The defendant's challenge lacks merit." End quote. Let me repeat the critical part. The challenge lacks merit. Judge Cannon did not say she disagreed with the defense interpretation. She said their argument lacks merit entirely. Defense argument 2. The charges are politically motivated and should be dismissed as prosecutorial misconduct. Quote, the court finds no evidence of political motivation in the charges brought by the special counsel. The evidence presented supports each count of the indictment. End quote. This is devastating for the defense because it means the judge reviewed their claims of political persecution and found them completely without foundation. Defense argument 3. The search of Mar-a-Lago violated the Fourth Amendment and all evidence should be suppressed. Quote, the warrant was properly obtained, narrowly tailored, and executed in accordance with federal law. The defendant's motion to suppress is denied in its entirety. End quote. This was the defense's strongest argument, and Judge Cannon rejected it completely. As Judge Cannon continued reading, systematically destroying each defense argument, something extraordinary happened. The defendant, who had maintained his composure through months of legal proceedings, began to break down. Court observers reported that by the third denied motion, his hands were visibly shaking. By the fifth denial, he had his head in his hands. And when Judge Cannon reached her final ruling, setting the trial date for May 20th, 2024, the defendant was openly crying. But here is the moment that crystallized everything. Judge Cannon looked directly at the defendant and said, quote, Mr. Defendant, you will face trial on all 40 counts as charged. The evidence will be presented to a jury of your peers. The American people deserve to see justice done according to law, not according to political preference or personal power. End quote. That was when the defendant completely broke down. Sources in the courtroom reported that his sobs were audible throughout the gallery. Now let me explain what Judge Cannon actually ruled and why this decision is so comprehensive. The 40 counts fall into 3 categories, and the judge found that prosecutors had met the evidentiary standard for each category. Counts 1 through 31 are willful retention of national defense information under the Espionage Act. These charges require proof that the defendant knowingly retained classified documents and refused to return them when requested. Judge Cannon ruled that the evidence, including audio recordings, witness testimony, and the documents themselves, clearly supports these charges. Counts 32 through 34 are conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. These charges require proof that the defendant and co-conspirators plan to interfere with the federal investigation. Judge Cannon found that the communications between the defendant and his attorneys, his instructions to staff, and his public statements demonstrate clear intent to obstruct. Counts 35 through 38 are withholding a document or record. These charges require proof that the defendant concealed documents from investigators. Judge Cannon ruled that the evidence of documents hidden in various locations at Mar-a-Lago, despite multiple requests for their return, meets this standard. Counts 39 and 40 are corruptly concealing a document and scheme to conceal. Judge Cannon found that the defendant's actions went beyond simple retention to active concealment with corrupt intent. Here is what I need you to understand about this ruling. Judge Cannon did not just deny the motions to dismiss. She provided detailed legal reasoning for why each charge is supported by evidence. She explained why the defense arguments fail as a matter of law, and she made clear that this case will proceed to trial on schedule. Now let me address what you are probably thinking. Will the defendant appeal this ruling and delay the trial for months or years? Here is the legal reality. The defendant can file an interlocutory appeal, but federal law severely limits when appellate courts will hear appeals before trial. The defense would need to show that Judge Cannon made a clear error of law that would irreversibly harm their case. Given the thoroughness of her ruling and her detailed citations to established precedent, an appellate court is unlikely to find reversible error. More importantly, even if an appeal is filed, it does not automatically stop the trial. Judge Cannon made clear that trial preparation will continue regardless of any appeal. Jury selection is set to begin May 1, 2024. Opening statements are scheduled for May 20th. The prosecution estimates their case will take 6 weeks to present. The defense will then present their case, likely arguing that the retention was inadvertent and that there was no intent to harm national security. But here is what the defense cannot argue anymore. They cannot argue that the charges are legally insufficient. Judge Cannon rejected that argument. They cannot argue that the evidence was illegally obtained. Judge Cannon rejected that argument. They cannot argue that Special Counsel Smith lacks authority. Judge Cannon rejected that argument. The defense is now limited to arguing the facts, and the facts, according to the judge's ruling, strongly favor the prosecution. Let me tell you what this ruling means beyond this one case. Judge Cannon is a federal judge who was appointed by the defendant himself when he was president. She has been viewed by some as potentially favorable to the defense, but when presented with the law and the evidence, she ruled against the defendant on every significant motion. That tells you something important about the strength of Special Counsel Smith's case. This was not a liberal judge imposing a political outcome. This was not an activist court overreaching its authority. This was a federal judge appointed by the defendant himself, applying the law to the facts and concluding that the charges are supported by evidence and the case should proceed to trial. When your own appointee rules against you, that is a clear signal about the merits of the case. Here is what I need you to understand about the evidence that convinced Judge Cannon. The prosecution presented a 47-page brief detailing the timeline of classified document retention. The evidence includes surveillance footage from Mar-a-Lago showing boxes being moved after the FBI requested their return, phone records showing calls between the defendant and his attorneys immediately after receiving grand jury subpoenas, text messages between staff members discussing where to hide documents, and most damaging of all, audio recordings of the defendant himself acknowledging he knew the documents were classified and that he should not have them. Let me walk you through the most significant piece of evidence because it shows intent, which is crucial for these charges. On July 21, 2021, the defendant met with writers working on Mark Meadows' memoir at his Bedminster Golf Club. During that meeting, according to prosecutors, the defendant showed the writers classified documents detailing military plans regarding Iran. Quote from the audio transcript, "These are highly classified. See, as president I could have declassified it. Now I cannot, but this is still a secret." End quote. That statement alone destroys the defense argument that the defendant believed he had authority to retain classified documents. He explicitly acknowledged that he no longer had declassification authority. He explicitly acknowledged the documents were classified, and he showed them to individuals without security clearances, which violates multiple federal statutes. But the evidence gets even more damaging. After receiving the grand jury subpoena in May 2022, prosecutors alleged the defendant instructed his attorney to tell the FBI that all classified documents had been returned. This attorney, who has since cooperated with prosecutors, will testify that the defendant knew this statement was false because he had personally seen additional classified documents in the defendant's possession. The obstruction charges stem from what happened next. According to the indictment, the defendant directed staff to move boxes containing classified documents from a storage room to his personal residence. Security camera footage shows this movement occurred on the same day his attorney was scheduled to search for classified documents to comply with the subpoena. That is consciousness of guilt, and it demonstrates intent to obstruct the investigation. Now let me address something that legal experts are calling unprecedented about Judge Cannon's ruling. Federal judges rarely provide this level of detail when denying motions to dismiss, especially in high-profile cases. Judge Cannon spent 23 pages explaining her reasoning, citing 47 different federal cases, and addressing each defense argument individually. This suggests she anticipated appeals and wanted to create an appellate-proof record. The defense had argued that the Presidential Records Act gave the defendant authority to keep these documents. Judge Cannon rejected this argument decisively. Quote, "The Presidential Records Act governs presidential records, not classified documents belonging to the intelligence community and Department of Defense. The defendant's interpretation would render federal classification laws meaningless." End quote. This ruling eliminates what many legal experts considered the defense's strongest argument. The prosecution also presented evidence that the defendant showed classified documents to foreign nationals during events at Mar-a-Lago. While these incidents are not specifically charged in this case, Judge Cannon noted them as evidence of the defendant's pattern of mishandling classified information. This suggests the judge viewed the charges not as isolated incidents but as part of a broader pattern of disregarding national security protocols. Here is what makes this evidence particularly compelling from a prosecutorial perspective. The government does not need to prove the defendant intended to harm national security. They only need to prove he knowingly retained classified documents and refused to return them when requested. The audio recordings, witness testimony, and documentary evidence make this case, in the words of one former federal prosecutor, quote, "as close to a slam dunk as you can get in a classified documents case," end quote. Some will say this ruling proves the system is rigged against the defendant, but federal judges take an oath to uphold the Constitution and apply the law regardless of who appointed them. Judge Cannon did exactly that. She reviewed the defense arguments thoroughly, considered the relevant precedent carefully, and ruled based on legal merit, not political loyalty. Now let me explain why the defendant's breakdown matters legally and politically. For months, the defendant has projected confidence that this case would be dismissed, that the charges were politically motivated, that no jury would convict. That image required maintaining that the legal system was corrupt, that judges could be influenced, that evidence could be discredited through public pressure. But when Judge Cannon systematically rejected every defense argument, that image collapsed. You cannot claim a judge is biased when she was appointed by you. You cannot argue prosecutorial misconduct when a federal judge finds no evidence of it. You cannot claim the charges are baseless when a federal judge rules they are supported by evidence. The defendant's tears were not an act for the cameras. They were not a performance for his supporters. That was the realization that the legal system cannot be bullied, cannot be manipulated through public pressure, cannot be derailed through delay tactics. That was the moment when legal reality became undeniable. And that moment matters because it shows that no one is above the law, not even former presidents. Not because prosecutors say so, not because the media demands it, but because a federal judge appointed by the defendant himself says so. That is the foundation of our legal system. Equal justice under law, applied fairly regardless of political position or personal power. Here is what happens next, and why the timeline matters. Trial begins May 20th with jury selection. The prosecution will present their case first, likely calling current and former government officials to testify about classification procedures, FBI agents to describe the search of Mar-a-Lago, and former Trump administration officials to describe efforts to retrieve the documents. The evidence will include the classified documents themselves, shown to the jury under strict security protocols. But here is what makes this trial different from typical federal cases. Special Counsel Jack Smith has assembled what prosecutors are calling the most comprehensive classified documents case in American history. The prosecution team includes specialists in national security law, experts in classification procedures, and prosecutors who have successfully tried espionage cases. They have spent 18 months building this case, interviewing over 200 witnesses, and analyzing thousands of documents. The prosecution's opening statement will likely focus on a simple narrative. The defendant took classified documents when he left office, refused multiple requests to return them, lied about having them, and obstructed efforts to retrieve them. That narrative is supported by what prosecutors describe as overwhelming evidence. Security camera footage showing document movements, audio recordings of the defendant's own words, testimony from his former attorneys and staff members, and the classified documents themselves. Let me explain the prosecution's strategy because it reveals why Judge Cannon found their case so compelling. Prosecutors will present evidence chronologically, starting with the defendant's departure from office in January 2021 and continuing through the FBI search in August 2022. Each phase of the timeline demonstrates escalating attempts to conceal and retain classified documents. Phase 1, January to May 2021. The National Archives repeatedly requested presidential records from the defendant. During this period, prosecutors alleged the defendant was already showing classified documents to unauthorized individuals and refusing to acknowledge he possessed them. Phase 2, May 2021 to January 2022. The National Archives discovered classified documents were missing and began formal requests for their return. Prosecutors have email evidence showing the defendant's staff discussing how to avoid compliance with these requests. Phase 3, February to May 2022. The FBI became involved and issued a grand jury subpoena for all classified documents. This is when prosecutors alleged the obstruction conspiracy began, with the defendant directing staff to hide documents and instructing his attorney to make false representations to federal investigators. Phase 4, May to August 2022. After the defendant's attorney certified that all classified documents had been returned, the FBI continued to receive evidence that additional documents remained at Mar-a-Lago. This led to the search warrant and the recovery of over 100 additional classified documents. The defense will then present their case, likely arguing that any retention was inadvertent, that the defendant believed he had authority to keep the documents, and that there was no intent to harm national security. But they will do so without their strongest arguments, all of which Judge Cannon has already rejected. Here is what the defense cannot argue at trial based on Judge Cannon's ruling. They cannot argue the search was illegal because she ruled the warrant was properly obtained. They cannot argue the charges are politically motivated because she found no evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. They cannot argue the Presidential Records Act authorized retention because she ruled it does not apply to classified documents. This leaves the defense with limited options. They can argue the defendant reasonably believed he had authority to retain the documents, but the audio recordings undermine this argument. They can argue there was no intent to obstruct, but the evidence of document movement after receiving subpoenas contradicts this claim. They can argue the documents were not properly classified, but federal law places the burden on defendants to prove improper classification, which requires access to intelligence sources and methods that will not be available at trial. Most significantly, the defense faces what prosecutors call the consciousness of guilt problem. If the defendant believed his retention was legal, why did he move documents after receiving the subpoena? If he thought he had authority to keep them, why did he instruct his attorney to make false representations to the FBI? If the retention was inadvertent, why did he show the documents to unauthorized individuals and acknowledge they were classified? These questions will dominate the defense's case, and Judge Cannon's ruling suggests she found the prosecution's answers more persuasive than the defense explanations. If convicted on all counts, the defendant faces a maximum sentence of 400 years in prison. Realistically, federal sentencing guidelines suggest 10 to 20 years for someone with no prior criminal convictions. But here is what makes this case different. These are not financial crimes or personal misconduct charges. These are national security crimes involving the most sensitive classified information in the American government. Federal judges take national security crimes seriously because the potential harm extends far beyond any individual. When someone mishandles classified documents, they potentially compromise intelligence sources, endanger national security assets, and undermine America's ability to protect its interests around the world. Judge Cannon will consider that when determining any sentence. I will be covering every day of this trial from jury selection through verdict. I will be analyzing the evidence as it is presented, not as it is spun by either side. I will be explaining the legal significance of each witness, each document, each ruling, because this trial will be about more than one person. It will be about whether our legal system can hold powerful people accountable when they break federal law. The defendant's breakdown in court today was the moment when political rhetoric met legal reality. The tears were real because the consequences are real. 40 federal charges, supported by evidence that a federal judge found credible, prosecuted by a special counsel with a track record of winning complex cases, scheduled for trial in 4 months. Let me know in the comments what you think will happen when this case goes to trial. Will the defendant be convicted on all counts, some counts, or will the defense find a way to create reasonable doubt? I read every comment and I respond to as many as possible. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next analysis.